Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending this morning. We're so glad to see you all, even if it's just on a Zoom again. You're here this morning for Alliance Leads, and we'll hear from Jennifer Fowler-Hermes, a partner and chair of the labor and employment practice at Williams Parker. A housekeeping item: Jennifer will be discussing intricate topics. Some will require your direct conversation with a professional of your choice, obviously. I'm sure Jennifer would take your call as well. That can assist your business as it pertains to labor law. Please seek guidance before proceeding on the items that you may hear or issues you may hear before us today. So first, a little recognition for our annual sponsors. Our presidential level sponsor, and joining us this year at that level, is Bank of Tampa, the Brain Health Initiative, Grapevine Communications, Kirkering Barbario CPAs, Manatee County Government, the Players Center for Performing Arts, Wright Technology, Sarasota Memorial Healthcare System, and Williams Parker Harrison Dietz and Getson. Executive level sponsors: Bank of America, HH Staffing, Homes by Town, Iberia Bank, First Horizon, iHeartMedia, Lakewood Ranch Community Activities, Lakewood Ranch Medical Center, LECOM, Libby's Restaurant, the Mullet University Town Center, Molden and Jenkins CPAs, Michael Saunders and Company, The Observer and Business Observer, South Tech, Synovus Bank, and Willis Smith Construction. As usual, our corporate and associate level sponsors are visible on our website, and without all of our sponsors at all levels, we wouldn't be able to accomplish what we do towards the mission in supporting you, our members. A little bit this morning about Jennifer. As I said at the start, a partner and chair of the labor and employment practice at Williams Parker. As a board certified labor and employment attorney with over 20 years of experience, she has helped businesses effectively navigate an array of labor and employment matters. In addition to advocating for clients in litigation matters, Jennifer provides advice and guidance regarding the day-to-day employment-related business decisions, delivers management training, drafts employment-related documents, contracts, and policies, and collaborates with her clients. She's also a qualified arbitrator for all Florida courts and the Florida Supreme Court certified civil circuit mediator. So Lakewood Ranch presents Just the Facts on the Vaccine. What do employers need to know? Jennifer, thank you for being here this morning, and the floor is yours.
All right, had to unmute there. So welcome everybody. I know it's early, and let's just dive in. There were some questions that were presented when individuals registered, so I'm gonna make sure that I address each of those questions. What I would like you to do is I'm gonna give some basic overview. If you would like to ask questions, go ahead and put them. It looks like we have the chat available. I may not get to them all, but to the extent I can answer them, I will, unless, of course, you're asking me about, well, Ricky Bobby said that he can't do blah, 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 blah. What do I do? So this is not an opportunity for the specific legal advice, but to give you information about the considerations that come into play as you're looking at the vaccine and what as an employer you may want or need to do. So to start off with, let's take a look at what's going on currently. There is no federal requirement that employers mandate vaccines. And further to that, OSHA has not issued a mandate, even that certain sectors of business mandate vaccines. They have issued an opinion saying, particularly in healthcare, that it be encouraged by employers. The CDC has also not issued any kind of vaccine mandate, but again, we're relatively early in a new administration that is taking a different approach from what's been done before. So we're not sure where things are going to go from here. And finally, with respect to Florida, Governor DeSantis has said that he is not going to mandate vaccines. Does that mean that an employer can't mandate? No, that's not what that means. Actually, in December of 2020, the EEOC released guidance with respect to mandatory vaccination programs and considerations that employers should think about as they're evaluating them. Generally, when we're looking at mandatory vaccination programs, If it's job related and consistent with business necessity, such programs would be acceptable. So there's a couple different ideas when we're looking at vaccination programs. You can have a mandatory or a voluntary vaccination program. It's a little early right now because generally the vaccination is not available to everyone. So it's a really good time to start thinking as an employer about what you want to do. Do you want to do mandatory? Do you want to do voluntary? And one of the things we're going to talk about today are what are the considerations in determining whether or not we're going to have a vaccination program at all. And I'm going to just kind of go through it. I'm going to let you as the audience, because this was advertised as a Q&A, kind of lead us in different directions if it's a relevant direction. But let's just start off with, because there's not enough to go around right now, this is not the time to implement a mandatory vaccination program. It is time to consider whether or not you want to do that. And it's also a time to get it ready if you're going to do it. So in most instances, employers who have employees that interact with each other and that interact with the public probably will have a job related necessity, particularly while we're still in the pandemic. When you read through the EEOC's guidance, which when this is over, I've already provided links to every different guidance that I'm going to reference as we're talking, and those will be provided to those of you who signed up to attend. But if you take a look at the guidance, the EEOC's positions about certain things are slightly different because we are in a pandemic and this is considered a health crisis. So where before you weren't even allowed you weren't allowed to take temperatures, you are now because we're in a pandemic and there's public safety and a health crisis overall. I'm going to break it down now. We're going to go first and talk a little bit about mandatory vaccination programs and considerations as you're thinking about those. And then we're going to move into a voluntary vaccination program. So if we're talking about a mandatory vaccination program, some things you have to consider are what laws apply and what are some of the things we need to think about. The obvious one is the ADA, the EEO, and other civil rights statutes such as the EOC, GINA, Florida Civil Rights Act, as well as for those of you employers that happen to be in the city of Sarasota, the Sarasota ordinance, because any policy that you create is going to have to take that into consideration. The mandatory nature of vaccines, it can't be completely. There has to be, at least for those covered by the said statutes, some exceptions that apply. If we were in person, I would ask you to raise your hand and I would make you talk to me this early in the morning to get your blood flowing. But since we're on a Zoom, I'll go ahead and answer that question. Generally, the exceptions are going to be for disability or religious accommodations. And those get to be very technical. For those employers that already have very good procedures in place for requesting religious or disability accommodations, the exact same process would apply for someone asking to be exempt from a mandatory vaccination program. For those of you that don't already have that in place, that's something you need to think about. In taking a look at the issues that are coming up and a lot of the opinions that are being published out there, one of the things that is going to be the main focus is going to be the religious accommodation aspect to it. Because the religious accommodation under the EEOC guidance that currently exists is a very broad interpretation. I believe that as employers start moving through that process, this is going to be the most difficult aspect of a mandatory program. And so that's one thing that if you decide you're going to move in that direction, you need to work with counsel, not just to have it in writing and to have a program, but those that are implementing the program need to have training and they need to have a full understanding of exactly what that entails. In addition to that, if you're having a mandatory vaccination program, then it's part of a requirement that relates to the employment itself. And as that, you have to take a look at the Fair Labor Standards Act. It's probably going to be compensable time because it is a job requirement, particularly if it's going to happen during normal work hours. Number two, creates a situation where you probably should be in touch with a workers' comp carrier, because if someone has a negative reaction to a vaccine that's required, it's probably going to end up being a workers' comp claim. So before you implement and roll out, those conversations are necessary with your carriers to make sure that everyone understands what the role is, because if it is something that's going to be covered by workers' comp, then the normal workers' comp protocols, including a notice of first injury, are going to be required. And those that get the information from employees about what's going on in their life, well, you're going to have to understand, they're going to have to understand what's required and what the protocols are. So it's a good idea, now that we're looking hopefully in the future to having the availability of these vaccines, to not only start working toward getting our programs established, written up, getting all the forms we need, but in addition to that, making sure that those that are responsible know what needs to be done. And even our first line supervisors know that if someone does report having a reaction, that they need to immediately take that to HR. Some other issues that come up are issues related to OSHA. So that's another thing that you need to keep in mind. As I said earlier, right now, OSHA hasn't mandated for any particular industry, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen. There's some chatter coming out of some of the OSHA specialists that there's conversations going on between the administration and OSHA with respect to making certain changes, not only to vaccination, whether it's mandatory for certain areas, but also possibly even mask wearing. And mask wearing is something that is going to come up, because when you have a vaccination program, you also have to evaluate, well, for those that get vaccinated, are we going to require them to continue to wear masks? Are we going to, are we going to continue with the social distancing in place? And the answers to that, at least at the moment, are yes. OSHA actually earlier, it was in January, it's not this month. I forget, we're in February already. But OSHA has already come out with a guidance saying that even after receiving the vaccine, that workers should continue to wear masks, at least for now. There was a question posed with the registrations about enforcement of wearing masks in the office. And with any other policy, the same basic rules apply. Yes, you can have a policy requiring that individuals wear masks in the office. However, you need to be cognizant that there are certain situations where an accommodation needs to be made, and that accommodation is going to be specific to the individual. So, as with any other policy, it's going to be subject to the applicable laws and the requirements of those laws and how it's being interpreted. So there was a question about, is it going to be mandatory for medical offices or surgery centers? And the answer is, we don't know. Right now, it's not. Governor DeSantis has said he's not going to implement any kind of mandatory vaccination protocol. However, that doesn't mean that the federal government, through the CDC or through OSHA, might not do so. And the interesting thing is, if they decide to move through OSHA, then there's going to be an enforcement mechanism in place, which is one of the issues that we see with some of the mask wearing protocol, is there's no one to enforce it and there's no mechanism. If OSHA decides to take on either mask wearing or the enforcement of the vaccination protocols, then they will have the power to issue citations to employers that don't comply. And those citations can carry some pretty significant penalties depending on the seriousness of the violation. Still no questions. Come on, guys. I know it's early. This is an opportunity to ask questions. Some other things that come up when we're talking about mandatory vaccination protocols is a lot of employees, they might not have a religious objection or a disability, but I've actually gotten some emails from different clients saying, oh, well, they're talking about if we do this, it violates their privacy. And no, right now, under existing precedent, particularly in Florida here, it wouldn't violate their policy to have a mandatory vaccination program. However, it would violate their privacy if you're providing your clients information about your health information of your employees. So you shouldn't be going out and telling your individuals that you've got hey, well, Joey and Susie and Sally all have their vaccinations, but this person doesn't. Who do you want to do your hair? Those are things that you can't do. That their health information is protected. Some other considerations when we start talking about privacy issues really goes more into the ADA and medical information. And if someone is going to implement a mandatory vaccination program, how does that look? Do we do it in-house? Do we have a third party come in and do it? Do we send them outside? And those are additional questions. And each of those options have very different considerations. So if you send them outside and it's mandatory, then there's a very strong argument that the travel to the facility and the time spent getting the vaccination is compensable time, which means obviously that you're going to pay them. They could go into overtime. But in addition to that, another issue is the reverse side of that is if you do it in-house, there is a list of questions that are supposed to be asked of individuals before they get a vaccination. And those questions reveal health information that is not only protected health information under HIPAA, but it's also potentially questions that could be considered an improper medical questionnaire under the ADA. One of the links you're going to get after the program includes a link to the CDC's recommendations for these questions. So if you're doing this in-house, then you're having someone in-house asking these types of questions, which right now we really don't know how the EEOC is going to interpret that. But we do know that there is a potential for an issue in that situation. If an employer chooses to move forward with that kind of plan, there should be protocols in place, confidentiality agreements with the individuals that are asking the questions of the individuals, procedures in place for protecting the information and making sure that no one who doesn't need to know that sees that information. Having third parties come in and ask those questions and keep that information separate is probably the better way to go for most employers that decide to do this, because then they're not paying for the time spent traveling outside. But at the same time, they're not individually and actively involved in asking those questions. All right, so as I said earlier, one of the bigger issues is going to be the religious accommodation. And so when we're taking a look at that, not every belief is covered by the EEO laws with respect to not discriminating against individuals. And it's important to keep that in mind, because a lot of times, and we've already seen this to some extent in the healthcare industry, is that individuals are saying, I have a religious objection to this, but when the employer takes a look at it, it doesn't make sense. For instance, it's someone that has gotten a flu shot through the employer every single year, and now they're saying, oh no, I can't get shots. Well, did you just change your religious belief, or are you trying to utilize the religious accommodation in order to make sure that your concerns and fear about the vaccination, that you get yourself exempt? And so there will be those situations, and those are situations that definitely get in touch with your counsel, whoever that may be, to try to help you through that process. I'm going to jump over right now and talk a little bit about the voluntary programs, because of a lot of employers that I'm working with right now in the healthcare industry, particularly nursing homes, are taking the voluntary approach to this simply because there's a shortage of CNAs, and they're concerned that they will have employees jumping ship and going somewhere else that doesn't have a mandatory program. And so when you have a voluntary program, the balance of interest is slightly different. For instance, if it is voluntary, truly voluntary, then that's not something that generally you would have to require payment for the time spent doing it. Now, obviously, if you have a third party coming in and doing it in-house, it's not going to take that much time. So it doesn't really matter in that regard. The important thing is that when you're taking a look at these voluntary programs, one of the ways that employers want to implement this is to incentivize having the vaccination. But just in the last month and a half, we've had some issues in terms of some gray area where there actually isn't a bright line rule about what this means. There's EEOC a couple years ago, actually 2016, issued guidance with respect to wellness programs and what you can and cannot do under EEO law with respect to wellness programs and incentive in those programs. And there has been question about whether or not incentives to get the vaccines implicate those concerns. And along those lines, just before the Trump administration's time in office came to a close, the EEOC issued a draft guidance with respect to wellness and clarifying what is an appropriate and not an appropriate incentive. Interestingly enough, shortly after taking office, the Biden administration put a hold on that until such time that the new director of the EEOC could review it and ascertain what they wanted to do with it. And right now, we haven't heard anything. Actually, I think it was a couple weeks ago, is a lot of groups, including the Chamber of Commerce, urged the EEOC to actually take time to clarify the legality of vaccine incentives to allow employers to use those types of incentives to get their employees to be vaccinated. Still no questions. All right. So, you know, there was so when you're dealing with those incentives and you're dealing with the voluntary vaccination protocols, those are things to keep in mind. Now, one question is, can you have a mix of mandatory and voluntary vaccination protocols? And it depends. And it depends on the purpose. So for instance, if you're a healthcare facility and let's say you have a COVID wing and you have certain people that work in the COVID wing, and then you have another wing with the non-COVID patients, that seems like a clear example of where maybe you have mandatory vaccination for the COVID wing and a voluntary vaccination program for the non-COVID wing. So again, as employers, this is the time to sit down. Do I even want to put my toe in the water when it comes to vaccinations? And if I do we want it to be mandatory? Do we want it to be voluntary? Do we want to have a mix? I'm guessing the larger the employer, the more likely there might be a mix depending on what someone does. Obviously, you know, those workforces that prior to COVID had everybody working remotely and no interpersonal interaction, that would be a situation where clearly you're not going to have that need, that job related necessity to require individuals to get vaccinations. So when you're looking at a workforce and you've decided, well, we're going to keep this part of the workforce even after COVID's over home and not working with other people, then those might be individuals or a class of individuals that are exempt from your programs. We look at the questions that came in. I'm going to go back to the questions with respect to privacy and sharing information. Again, I know there's going to be those situations where you have clients or customers that come in that demand to know if your workforce has been vaccinated or if specific individuals. And so again, hard, fast rule, do not give information about specific individuals. However, if you implement a vaccination program, there is arguably some value in just having a little, you know, we have a mandatory vaccination program. The only problem with that, even though it doesn't violate anyone's privacy, to say as a whole that your organization has a mandatory vaccination program or that it has a voluntary vaccination program, is that it will inevitably open the door to further discussion. And if you're going to do that, individuals in your organization need to be prepared to shut down those questions that start relating to specific individuals. Whether it's mandatory or voluntary, there's still there's still a determination to be made when there is accommodations at issue. And when we're dealing with accommodations, again, it is going to be very difficult for employers. I'm going to stop that thought for a minute because I did get a question from an audience member, and the question was, what is the best place to find a list of who's considered an essential worker in Florida? And that's pretty much going to be one of two places, the Florida Department of Health and also the governor's office. The governor has executive orders, but typically the Florida Department of Health will probably be the best place to do it. With the links that are going to go out following this presentation, there is a link to the COVID page on the Florida Department of Health, and that can take you to where you need to go. There is obviously differences in states. So for those employers who have workforces, not just in Florida, but in other states as well, you need to make sure to check each state's requirements with respect to who is an essential worker. Back to the accommodations. One thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with accommodations is how are you going to handle that? If you have a mandatory vaccination program, what are you going to do if someone gets an accommodation? Because obviously, if this is a job-related requirement that's consistent with business necessity, you can't just let that person not get a vaccination and take no further precautions. Because if you do that, you undermine the position that this was a job-related requirement, that it was a business necessity. So you have to take a look at, well, what can we do? What kind of accommodations are available to those that get either religious or disability-based exemption from these types of policies? One thing is mask wearing, which right now, as I said earlier, OSHA has said that even if you get a vaccination, you should continue wearing masks. One of the things that I always say to clients that I'm working with right now is, if you have programs with respect to the flu vaccine, that's a good place to start, because a lot of your same considerations are going to come into play. So for instance, in a lot of healthcare facilities, when you're dealing with the flu vaccine and someone has an accommodation with respect to that, at least during the time period that the flu is in it's the worst part of the flu season, those individuals will be wearing masks. Obviously, everybody right now, particularly in the healthcare field, and it's recommended that individuals are wearing masks by the CDC. Those are things to consider. So if we get to a point where the CDC is no longer requiring mask wearing for those that have had the vaccination than those that don't, okay, fine. Well, you get to wear a mask for the rest of the time that you're here, at least till the pandemic is over. Other options could be, depending on the type of business, continuing to work from home. Obviously, there might be situations with that. You might have an individual whose productivity during the time frame when we were on lockdown and we were trying to have employees work from home on a regular basis, if their productivity is not that great and they're not able to perform the essential functions of their job from home, then that might not be an accommodation that's reasonable. You know, at some point you might end up backed into a corner where, you know, someone might not be permitted in the workforce anymore. But again, that is a very severe and dangerous consequence of these programs. And it's not something to be taken lightly. And it's not something to be done without the advice of your counsel, whoever that is, because, you know, you have to make sure that you're engaging in the interactive process, that you're gathering the relevant information that's necessary to make an appropriate determination, A, on whether or not an accommodation is appropriate, but also B, whether or not there's an undue hardship. Because when you take there's two different things. First, you have to ascertain if the person is entitled to an exemption from the rule. And once you make that determination, then it goes into the next step, which is, well, what do we do instead? If, is this someone that can continue to perform this position in light of the inability to comply with this policy? And that is a case-by-case individualized assessment that an employer who is covered by any of the applicable statutes is going to have to engage in, obviously to protect from liability, because generally when I get involved, if it's not on the front end to try to prevent it, it's, oh, this is what happened. When you're dealing with someone, document. Make sure that you have documentation on all of your efforts and work with each individual that tries to get an exception from your policy, to make sure that you show as an employer that you made a good faith effort to engage in that interactive process to ascertain whether or not there was a reasonable accommodation available. Still no more questions. All right. So another question is whether or not employers have to pay for their employees to be vaccinated when they have vaccination programs. And again, the answer is really, that depends. If you're requiring it as part of a job, there is a stronger argument that it needs to be reimbursed. If it's a voluntary one, it's not as strong that you have to reimburse. But if you really want people to be incentivized to take the vaccine, then obviously covering the cost of the vaccine to the extent there is any is a very good thing to do, because it places less burden and less obstacles for that employee to actually get that vaccination. So someone started to ask a question, but it only came through half. So Brenda, I'm not quite sure if you finished your question, but I would like to answer it. So please take a look at what you said and get me something a little bit more detailed so I can respond. This is not going to be easy. There's a lot of different questions. We've already talked about the difficulties with the programs and complying with EEO guidance, and just the general fear that a lot of people have with respect to the vaccines. But what is the alternative? What kind of issues might an employer face if they don't do anything? Because, right now, up to this point, we've been talking about mandatory programs versus voluntary programs. Well, what if we don't do anything? Well, right now that may be okay, but keep in mind that OSHA has what's called a general duty clause, which says that employers are responsible for providing a safe work environment. And right now, the fact of the matter is, I'm going back to the title that Dan and Dom gave this presentation. The fact of the matter is, we do not know whether or not OSHA is going to take the position that at least encouraging employees to get a vaccination is required under that standard. We are hopeful in the future that we're going to get a little bit more information from OSHA, and I very much expect that we will. I know the new administration is taking a more aggressive approach with respect to COVID and with respect to getting people vaccinated. And I believe it's only a matter of time before we get more guidance and possibly even regulations from OSHA explaining what the expectations are going to be. And so, there's so many different options for employers in terms of how to approach this. There are those that are going to choose the wait and see. I'm going to wait and see if there's a requirement that comes down. I'm going to wait and see whether or not there's guidance as to the general duty clause in OSHA. And then there are others that are like, we want to get in, we want to make our workplace as safe as possible. And we believe that having people vaccinated is the way to do that. And if you're an employer that believes that, then that's where you go and start trying to decide, do we want to do mandatory? Do we want to do voluntary? And then do an assessment of exactly what the best bet is for your specific business. Okay, here we go. If we want vaccines required in our company and employees refuse without any other reason, then they just don't want to take it, how do we possibly enforce? Well, that's the thing about a mandatory vaccination program. If you really have a mandatory vaccination program and individuals refuse to take it and they're not qualified for an exemption, then the question is, what are you going to do? Because if you don't take action and maybe terminate them or take some adverse employment action against them, then it's truly not a mandatory vaccination requirement. It's a voluntary one. I have a friend of mine, it's not a client, but I have a friend of mine that works for an organization that has and I'm going to put it in air quotes, mandatory vaccination program. They have exemptions for religion, they have exemptions for disability, and they have exemptions just for an objection. And I'm like, well, that is not a mandatory vaccination program. If you can get out of it just because you have an objection, it's a voluntary one. It's just couched in a different way to kind of push your employees in that direction. With the vaccines being so new, don't companies who require them open themselves up to lawsuits down the line? My response is Morgan and Morgan. I mean, you're going to get, whether you do or you don't, and whether or not it's a valid lawsuit, people are going to get sued. And so, at the end of the day, you have to take your risks where you feel it's appropriate. It's a very hard question, and we're just starting to see the influx of lawsuits with respect to the FFCRA and the leaves that were provided under the FFCRA and the retaliation provisions in that. And I anticipate that there is going to be litigation with respect to mandatory vaccination protocols, which is why some employers might opt for a mandatory vaccination protocol that truly is a voluntary one that just looks like something else. Or they might just go for voluntary altogether and provide incentives to those who participate. Again, if it is mandatory and there is a negative reaction, it could very well fall under workers' comp, which generally would be the sole remedy for a workers' comp type injury. So that's another thing to think about. And like I said at the beginning of the presentation, that is definitely something to have a conversation with your workers' comp carrier to see what their position is and whether or not, if it's mandatory, if they believe it would be covered. Those are very good points to consider as you're trying to determine what's best for your organization. Here. In a voluntary program, should the employer pay for PTO if the employee has an adverse reaction? If yes, can there be a maximum? So, that was Linda. And Linda, let me, that's a great question. And right now, as I said earlier, if you agree to pay for PTO, that could be considered an incentive. And right now it's unclear what the EEOC's position is going to be about incentives for that. I do have clients that have said, you know what, I'm going to do what I believe is right. And we're going to do that. And we're going to tell our employees we're going to do that. And if someone comes after us for violating the wellness program incentive provisions, we're going to deal with that on the backside. This is a situation where it's not a clear line and we don't know, just as when this whole pandemic started, we're dealing with new issues that have never really taken place before. And so one of the things that we recommend is that clients take a look at the options, they weigh the potential liabilities, And the option that they feel has the most benefit for them with the least liability is probably the best way to go. And if you decide to pay PTO, if the employee has an adverse reaction and it's a voluntary program, yes, you can put a cap on it. So we have another one. If it is a religious accommodation, would it be appropriate to ask for documentation from the priest, rabbi, etc., as you would from a doctor if it were a medical disability requirement? It's a very good question. And the answer is generally no, but. So the EEOC in its guidance, and I've also given a link that you'll be getting after this presentation to the EEOC's guidance on religious accommodation. The EEOC takes the position that generally you should believe someone when they say they have an objection. The issue comes up when you as the employer have an objective belief that there is a problem. And I gave you a specific example before. So if you have a vaccination program for the flu vaccine and you have someone that regularly participates in that and signs up for it, and all of a sudden they're making an objection to this vaccine, at that point, that would probably be a situation where you could ask for additional documentation. One of the things I would suggest is you have forms done in advance for when you implement a policy like this. And you have one form for a request for religious accommodation and another for disability accommodation. And in the one for religious accommodation, you don't actually have a statement requiring it, but you say that the employer may require. And then you have that case by case assessment on whether or not this particular example is one where we decide that we want that additional documentation. One of the things that I've been doing is I've been looking at some of the litigation with respect to the flu vaccine and where courts are going with some of the religious objections to the flu vaccine, because I think that's going to be somewhat telling in how the COVID vaccine might be handled. And generally it comes down to whether or not there's an objective belief that the person is being disingenuous with their request for an accommodation. So there was a question about what my firm is doing, and actually right now I don't know. But I will say this: there's been a lot of reports in the legal community that everyone's kind of waiting around to see what other individuals are doing. But I will say that there was a report, I think it was a week and a half ago, that one of the Big 10 law firms coming out of New York had implemented it's not yet because the vaccine isn't ready, but they made an announcement that when the vaccine is readily available for all individuals, that they will have a mandatory vaccination program, especially for those that are coming into the office and having face-to-face contact with clients. So, all right, that's the last question I have right now. Are there any other questions out there at this point? With respect to the vaccination protocols, accommodations. So since there's not, I'm going to talk about the back side of it. Let's say you implement either a voluntary or a voluntary program. What kind of challenges can you expect? If someone believes that a request for disability accommodation to be exempt from the policy, or a request to be exempt from the religious on religious beliefs, what's going to probably happen is what a lot of you already know from general requests for accommodation. In order to bring suit under Title VII, the EOC, or any EEO law, including the ADA, generally, they're going to file a charge with an EEO agency, whether it be the Florida Commission on Human Relations, the EOC itself, or some local entity. There are still some of those out there. And at that point, you would have the opportunity to mediate in most cases. The one thing that gives me a little bit of heartburn with respect to what's going to happen is obviously As administration change, the pendulum on pro-employer, pro-employee tends to swing back and forth. And we've already seen the pendulum starting to really swing back in another direction, which is pro-employee. And the only thing that gives me a little bit of concern is, are we going to have a leader of the EOC who makes religious accommodation a priority? And if we find that that happens, then one of the things that might end up happening is more active involvement by the EEOC and potentially more litigation by the EEOC on these issues. Right now, I'm just extrapolating. We don't know, but it is something to keep in mind. It's a very good idea to make sure you fully evaluate every single accommodation request in the event you have these vaccination programs. The other thing is to keep an eye on what's happening, because although right now, if you take a look at the EEOC's guidance with respect to COVID and vaccinations and when they're permitted and when they're not, the EEOC some time ago, probably a couple months into this pandemic, did say that COVID is considered a direct threat. And that's the reason why we can take temperatures. And that's the reason why we can ask if they feel okay. And it's a reason why we can do a lot more with respect to finding out health information of our employees than we were able to do before. But once we are out of the pandemic, that direct threat analysis is probably going to change. And once the EEOC determines that it's not a direct threat, then our accommodation analysis is going to be different. Because when we're looking at accommodations under either the ADA or under Title VII within a religious accommodation, we're taking a look at, okay, so A, are they entitled to an accommodation? Is there an accommodation available? And in ascertaining whether or not there's accommodation available, we have to make a determination on whether or not an accommodation would pose a direct threat. So, and when it's a direct threat, then we don't necessarily have to accommodate. And that creates an interesting scenario, and it's another one to remember that the analysis of direct threat is very different under religious accommodation as opposed to disability. With disability, the direct threat, it has to be an undue burden on the employer in order to be a direct threat. Again, if you have individuals that are working with immunocompromised patients or those that are very high risk, and you want to implement a mandatory program, you're going to be in a better position to argue a direct threat than those that generally don't have that kind of interaction. From a religious accommodation perspective, the standard is different, and it's whether it's a de minimis burden on the employer, which is quite different. And although it's an easier burden for an employer to meet, the expense of litigation is still about the same, and the risk of likely litigation is probably going to be the same, except for the fact that you have a lot of groups out there that are putting information out there and are supporting litigation that challenges individuals, or not individuals, but that on behalf of individuals challenges employers that fail to provide accommodations. There was a case actually in January with the flu vaccine, where it was a healthcare facility that had a mandatory flu vaccine program. And I see we have 10 minutes left. That had a mandatory flu vaccine program. And they said, if you don't take the flu vaccine because of an accommodation, then you're going to be required to wear a mask at all times. And this was a case that arose prior to COVID, but it was heard after COVID started. And it was interesting because the way the court looked at it is they said, look, yes, this person had a religious, an appropriate objection based on religion. However, they never said they had a objection to the alternative. because it was in the policy that the alternative was mask wearing, it was not considered an accommodation. It was considered a mandatory alternative. And because that employee had not objected to the mask wearing and then proceeded not to wear the mask and therefore violated the policy, they upheld the termination of that employee. Question, do you see any problem if we offer a cash incentive to employees who get the vaccine, and can we require proof of the vaccine? So the cash incentive, that is something a lot of employers are doing. Again, I'm going to go back to the beginning when I was saying, you know, we're still trying to get clarification on whether or not incentives with respect to vaccines would violate some of the provisions of the EEOC's guidance relating to wellness. Right now, the answer is we really don't know. You have to assess whether or not you're going to have a greater issue, or maybe just hold off a little while, because the EEOC has indeed been urged to provide guidance, and maybe they will do so. And can you require proof of the vaccine? If you have a mandatory program and you're having your employees do the testing off site, then they can come and show their card. And that would be sufficient proof. And I believe the EEOC guidance even addresses that head on. Any other questions? Come on, you got 8 more minutes. Let's get some questions going. Somebody's typing. So Dom, do you have any questions?
No, I think we covered a lot. I don't know that we have to. If there's no more questions, Jennifer, we can wrap up. You did a great job, and I'm hoping that if there are additional questions, we get them here at the Alliance. We can forward them to you, and I'm sure you'll either help address or maybe even meet with those clients that may need to be met with.
Well, one of the things I would like to do is before we get off, since there is no questions, is to just go over some of the links and why they're being provided. Sure. So attendees, you're all going to get a several links sent to you after the fact, and they include the following: the coronavirus and COVID EEOC. They have a page with a lot of different links to different provisions that are relevant in the analysis of handling COVID, including vaccination protocols. The most important link from that is also on the list, which is what you should know about COVID-19, the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, and other EEOC laws. The information related to vaccines, I'm going to tell you, you have to scroll down for an extended period of time because they just kind of added it to another guidance, but it is there. Don't give up. Just keep scrolling till you find it. Also, pandemic preparedness in the workplace and the ADA. This is an older document. It was created with respect to the flu vaccine and implementing programs under the flu vaccine. Again, for right now, that's a great reference on where to start if you decide you want to do one of these vaccination programs. The coronas, I don't know how many of you know about Ask Jan, but the DOL runs an accommodation page called the Job Accommodation Network. They also have a list of resources on their website. And so the next link that you'll be given is the Ask Jan page, which for the disability related questions as to reasonable accommodation, they provide some suggestions on questions to ask that are appropriate and how to handle those requests, particularly as it relates to COVID vaccination protocols. You will be provided a copy of the enforcement guidance on reasonable accommodation and undue hardship. That's very important so that those individuals in your organization will understand what an undue hardship truly is. You can't just say, well, that's an undue hardship. You have to really understand it, do the analysis, document the analysis, and be prepared to defend a decision based on undue hardship. And that guidance will give you some direction there. Also, what you should know about workplace religious accommodation. This is just a general, again, accommodation framework that's not specific to COVID. But as you're getting prepared to implement your programs and your policies, it's a very good thing to keep in mind that those people doing this analysis truly need to understand. And so this link is a really good resource in understanding what a religious accommodation is and when it can be denied. I also provided information about the vaccine administration and what's in it, because sometimes the disabilities are tied to um, uh, allergies. I'm like, I have them. What are they? Allergies are tied to specific allergies. And this page gives you information about each of the vaccines and what's in them. So if someone has a sensitivity, maybe you're giving the Pfizer vaccine and they have a sensitivity to something in the Pfizer vaccine that isn't in one of the other vaccines, then as part of the accommodation process, you can maybe have a conversation and say, hey, well, this vaccine doesn't have that. And finally, I gave a link to the Florida Department of Health with respect to COVID vaccines. That would be a good place to go to watch the availability of vaccines in Florida, particularly if you're anticipating putting one of these programs, whether it be mandatory or involuntary, in place, because that way you'll know a little bit more information about when is an appropriate time to actually roll out and start enforcing these policies. And so those are the links that are going to be coming to you to help give you some context as you're evaluating A, whether or not to have a program, B, if you're having a program, whether or not you want it to be mandatory, whether or not you want it to be voluntary. And in the mandatory programs, additional information to assist you in being prepared to handle those requests for accommodations. So. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to see everybody up this morning, although I don't see a lot of faces. You're probably still working on your first or second cup of coffee. I've only had one, so as soon as we're done, I'm going to go get my second one, and then I'll talk even faster. But thank you so much for having me, Don, Dan. I always appreciate being part of the programs that your organization offers. It's a great organization. Although I don't quite live in Lakewood Ranch, I'm kind of past that because I'm all the way out in Mayaca. I do spend a lot of time in Lakewood Ranch because we don't have anything in Mayaca. So, all right. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. And like I said, these are very special issues. And as you implement, seek the advice of your counsel, whoever that might be. There's lots of great people here in town. So.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. We truly appreciate your energy and obviously the information you provided to the members as well. And we'll keep coming back to you because you are with that energy so able to deliver in a positive fashion. So thank you. On the close, a couple events that are coming up. Thursday, February 18th, we have part 3 of the 5-part series, The Blitz. Another sensational leader will be speaking to you all about making it through the change that we've had the last year. Thursday, February 25th, lunch with ranchers at the Courtyard by Marriott. There's still a few seats left. Thursday, February 25th, that evening, YLA is having a social at Libby's here in Lakewood Ranch. And Friday, February 26th, our annual luncheon at the Grove. So usually a 300 to 400 person event. We're limiting seating, and I wanted to thank Bank of Tampa for being our presenting sponsor for the annual luncheon. So we hope to see some of you either virtually and or in person in the next coming weeks. So thank you again, Jennifer, for your time this morning and for everyone who attended, and have a great day. Take care.
You too.